Hi folks, two quick notes before we get into the second Lord of the Rings video, which I recorded earlier today. One, I saw some comments that implied, yes I do sometimes look at the comments now, that implied that people came to the video thinking that I was going to read the Lord of the Rings aloud. I'm pretty sure that I legally can't do that. The work is still in copyright. If you'd like to hear me read something, I mean, there's the audiobooks of the Poetic Edda and the Saga of the Volsungs. Or potentially, if people just want something read, I can read some Old Norse stuff at some point. There's a campfire reading of the Cowboy Hávamál, a couple other readings of text in Old Norse on the channel. There's stuff like that, but I don't think anything by J.R.R. Tolkien is something that I can legally just read to you without it being a performance of that work, and therefore intellectual property rights protected. All right, so that's one thing. Second thing is I am not a I am I am a god awful nerd and pedant about certain subjects, but they tend to be older than Tolkien. I do not know a whole ton about J.R.R. Tolkien's mythos, so you will occasionally probably be baffled and want to shout at me about not knowing something. But I think that part of the potential interest of my commentary on The Lord of the Rings is that I know a lot of the background stuff Tolkien himself knew without having been heavily involved in his fandom. So, let me off a little easier. Don't come at me too much with the actual stuff. That's part of the point of why perhaps it's a little bit interesting what I might think about this work. All right, here's the video commentary on the next few chapters of the Fellowship of the Ring. Hi, I'm Old Norse specialist Dr. Jackson Crawford, back for part 2 of my read-through of The Lord of the Rings. If you put yourself in mind of where I first was when I read this book, thinking about the late 90s, mid to late 90s in Golden, Colorado, kind of a similar physical environment to this. I'm not going to drive all the way to Golden, but I thought that the two back-to-back videos about the Lord of the Rings ought to look a little bit different, so I came back for one of my classic backgrounds and one that looks a little bit like the environment where I grew up. So let's take a look at the next few chapters of the Fellowship of the Ring. I feel like I did a fair amount of just like personal commentary on this book in the first video. Right, it kind of got beyond just Old Norse stuff and got into more my personal thoughts and like literary criticism. I think that's fine in a sense, because that's also part of my unique take on it. But I'm aware, as Tolkien says, that what some love, some will hate. He said something like that in the foreword that really stuck with me. Oh, speaking of things some people will hate, I've got to put on my mic because otherwise I'll get 10 times more complaints about volume. One sec. Okay, yeah, I'm a quiet talker who lives in a windy place. Sometimes the volume is not perfect. Also not very technologically proficient. Man, speaking of things people will complain about. All right. So we get into chapter 3. 3 is company, and I feel like, at least for a little while, we're kind of back in a kid's book again, right? I mean, I was given pause by this sentence, quote, "A fox passing through the wood on business of his own. Stopped several minutes and sniffed. Hobbits, he thought. Well, what next? Etc., etc., etc." Off quote. Like, what is this? Why are we getting the fox's eye view? And it occurred to me that, this book is such an accidental masterpiece. I really don't think J.R.R. Tolkien anticipated that millions of people were going to read this, and then millions more were going to see movies based on it long after his death. It seems really kind of accidental, and in a way, this just bizarre bit that, if I had been editing this book, I would have said, cut this the hell out of there. Kind of reminds me, it's charming, right? It kind of reminds me this is a personal project that in a way makes it more appreciable because it's not that polished. And boy, does the not that polished strike me more and more as we go through the next few chapters. I mean, after chapter 2 kind of got that more serious tone, these few chapters, there's some just bizarre stuff in here. But there's also some stuff that's really evocative. I mean, there are really nice just atmospheric descriptions of not just setting, but things happening in the setting. For example, when the three hobbits, Frodo, Sam, and Pippin, are being pursued by this ring wraith, some really evocative description here. For example, quote, it showed gray and pale a line of fading light through the wood. Above it the stars were thick in the dim sky, but there was no moon. The sound of hoofs stopped. As Frodo watched, he saw something dark pass across the lighter space between two trees and then halt. It looked like the black shade of a horse led by a smaller black shadow. The black shadow stood close to the point where they had left the path, and it swayed from side to side. Frodo thought he heard the sound of snuffling. The shadow bent to the ground and then began to crawl towards him. That's good horror writing, right? I mean, I'm off quote if I didn't say that. I'm struck by how he pictures the scene for us. You don't get this kind of thing in the sagas, right? Part of what has occurred to me as I've gone through this book is that as much as I have said and others have said that people get drawn to reading Old Norse literature, maybe to a certain extent Finnish literature, from reading The Lord of the Rings because they influence Tolkien, you do not get that kind of landscape description that he sometimes dwells on at such length, and you do not get these scene settings that way, right? The only way in which Tolkien's writing strongly resembles Icelandic sagas is that he does imitate the obsession with genealogy that's there, and he does get into some really long dialogue. But in description, he's extremely unsaga-like, and I was struck by that. We then have a bunch of stuff in these chapters that doesn't come up in the movies. Frodo and Sam and Pippin meet some quote-unquote high elves. I think that it's interesting, this distinction between high and low. As I recall the Silmarillion from reading it a long time ago, interestingly, a book that made more of an impression on me than Lord of the Rings, that tells you what kind of insufferable, pedantic kid I was. The high elves are high because they were like with the gods, the Maiar of Valar, right? Whereas there's the low elves or dark elves who were, over here on Middle Earth, something like that. And of course, we get something kind of classist about the high elves being the ones who just happen to be among the even higher beings. There's a certain classism that runs through this book sometimes that really shows up in that sort of thing, as well as in depictions of Sam as kind of dumber and less disciplined than the other hobbits, although at the same time it's a little bit moderated by the fact that Tolkien clearly has an affection for Sam and his sort of lower class tastes and bearing. But at any rate, I note that the high elf language here, I think this is Quenya, right? Ellen si lalum menomentielvo, a star shines on the hour of our meeting. Sounds very Finnish, and I believe that was his intent, that should sound a good bit like Finnish. Not the words be Finnish. I mean, lumen sounds like Latin if that's the light or star word, but that phonetically it would sound like Finnish. There's also, of course, here's something that struck me as funny. Quote, now and again he, Frodo, spoke to those that served him and thanked them in their own language. They smiled at him and said, laughing, here is a jewel among hobbits. And I thought, this is a philologist or linguist fantasy, right? That someone will think that we are jewels for knowing these obscure languages, when in fact people mostly look at us as weird. It reminds me of some tweets from my old Twitter account back when I did that on similar subjects. But yeah, it's a fantasy that people will think it's cool that we know Old Norse or Quenya or whatever, when in fact people just say, huh, that's weird, and try to get away from us. I'll get into chapter, 4 here, shortcut mushrooms. Let me just give you a quick word from my friends and partners at Grimfrost. and your Grimfrost stuff arrives in a box the size of a small microwave or whatever the Casper mattress advertisement is. They'd probably hate me if I started making joke endorsements of products that way. So Shortcut to Mushrooms is a lot more just kind of, to me, kind of kiddie Hobbit interaction stuff. There's a lot of talk about the Marish, which I understood to be a marsh. It sounds like a regional pronunciation. I don't know if that's a particular regional pronunciation in an area close to Tolkien's heart or something, but that was the main thought I had from A Shortcut to Mushrooms. By chapter 5, A Conspiracy Unmasked, we have, again, this is all stuff that's not in the movies. Frodo and the hobbits come to the house that he's supposed to move to as a cover after leaving Hobbiton, so people don't know that he's going on this long expedition. We read a lot of this background about the Brandy Bucks and their numerous dependents, A-N-T-S, very pedantic spelling that just about nobody would use today. I noted some very, very English place names, Buckleberry, Newberry, these berry place names. And berry, of course, is related to the English cognative, the Borg in Scandinavian place names like Göteborg, what people in English usually call Gothenburg. Just strikes me as super English and old. Not a place name type that you hear around the U.S. very much, except maybe in Virginia and Pennsylvania, which are almost another country to me. I again struck by just how much, this is another thing that's sort of saga-like, that Tolkien gives you so much detail, and he does it in a way that's so unself-aware that it would just be so hard to imitate this, and like I think fantasy writers do try to imitate this, and do it kind of unsuccessfully. Like the next best example of this I can think of, and it actually might be a better example of it in some ways, but although in a very different way, is Harry Potter, because she puts you into this environment that's so described in such detail and suggests so many details beyond the details that you see, that you just feel like you're being, lowered into a bath of it, right? You can totally sort of step out of the world around you if you're tempted to do that. I'm not much of a fantasy reader. If we put ourselves back in my frame of mind and place when I first read this, again, mid to late 90s, Golden, Colorado, my grandfather discouraged me from reading anything that didn't concern the real world. I'm thankful to him for that in some ways. I think that it also had something of the opposite effect at times, because it meant that anything fantasy or sci-fi was a little bit rebellious to be interested in, right? So it invested it with more meaning than it needed to have. Although the main thing that I got involved in was not so much like reading Tolkien or anything else, but it was rather a knockoff Dungeons and Dragons, basically, right? The Rifts role-playing game, which for whatever reason was what was popular in Colorado in the 90s rather than Dungeons and Dragons proper. Anyway. Another thing struck me as kind of a personal fantasy in this book. I wondered if the kind of community that he describes in Hobbiton is a little bit of a fantasy about community, but I also thought that the super, super tight bonds between Frodo and Sam and Pippin and Merry and I guess Fredegar are kind of a fantasy about friends. Now, it might be, again, not a fantasy, but a nostalgia for something that he experienced once that's just not common, but these hobbits who are willing to just run off with Frodo at the drop of a hat and risk their lives for him. It's like, I have some good friends, but they've got to pay the bills, right? They're not going to run off with me and potentially sacrifice their lives on some mission that I've got to go on. It strikes me as like maybe the nostalgia there is for a kind of companionship that Tolkien found in World War I. I don't know. But I would find that a plausible explanation for that. But I can't imagine that kind of friendship is common, or that the experience of that kind of tight bonding is common. And I think that Tolkien is evoking an experience, real or imagined, and I'm again kind of suspecting real when I reflect on his World War I experiences, that is so uncommon as to verge on fantasy for most people. And I think that is also part of the magic of the book, right? Just the bonds between people who are very different. Because, give him some credit, I can't always tell the difference between Pippin and Merry as characters, but that Pippin-Merry character versus Frodo versus Sam are really different characters. Like, he does sketch out really different people, and despite those differences, they have that close personal bond. I find that a compelling thing one wants to read on about. Like, how does this get resolved? How do these characters what happens to them? I actually kind of wonder if the secret in writing good fantasy is in a sense whispering louder than you talk. What do I mean by that? It's all these extra details they suggest. Like we get into chapter 6, the Old Forest, and there's all of this extra stuff that you don't need. All this background about the Old Forest that borders the Brandy Bucks, and this history about, like the trees fighting the hobbits and the hobbits fencing the trees and all this stuff. And I mean, like, you don't need this story, but it tells you that there's 20 more stories this thick that this guy could probably tell you about his world, and all of them would be equally sort of charming and interesting. I thought that another really well painted picture, by the way, was also in this chapter, where he describes this hill, this bare mound that the hobbits come to in the middle of a forest, and it's so high that they look back down the bare hill and they see, just darkness in the trees, and can imagine the trees going down forever. Very evocative, not a scene familiar to someone from a more arid environment, but it kind of reminds me of places I've seen in like Michigan or Ohio, where the forest is very thick, and sometimes you come across American Indian mounds. I was reminded of something called the Alligator Mound around Chillicothe, Ohio, that I once visited. I was imagining something like that, but in a thicker forest. Anyway, evocative. I thought that was cool. I was surprised when Merry said less flies when they're being attacked by the trees rather than fewer flies. I would have expected the more pedantic fewer from Tolkien, but maybe he's trying to suggest that Merry, like Sam, does not speak entirely proper. And then we get into Tom Bombadil, which God knows what the hell I can say about this. I'm as astonished by this character and who he is, and like what he's doing when he's not saving hobbits. Right? Like, what is the home life of Tom Bombadil and the River Woman like? I just, it's utterly baffling. I understand why this is left out of every movie, except I think legendarily the terrible Soviet adaptation. But yeah, so we've got another chapter about Tom Bombadil coming, and then looks like the Barrow Downs chapter. It was asked in the comments if I'd do 3-4 chapters at a time. I haven't planned it out that much. I was just kind of reading these when I got to them. But yeah, sure, let's say 3 chapters at a time. So I'll do chapters 7, 8, 9 of the Fellowship next. That seems like a reasonable amount. And then, 10, 11, 12? And then we're into book 2. Yeah, so 3 chapters at a time. So chapter 7, 8, 9 for next time. And thanks for watching. Thanks for your comments. Let me know what you think about this, and what your reactions to these parts of the book are. And appreciate your support on Patreon. Appreciate your support through the Amazon shop, where you can buy Lord of the Rings as well as my books. Don't forget, you can also buy my signed books at Boulder Bookstore. You can order those if you're looking for a unique gift or something like that. And from beautiful Colorado, I'm wishing you all the best.